Everything you were taught about how Easter Island destroyed itself is wrong. For 50 years, this island has been used as humanity's favorite warning story. A civilization so obsessed with building giant stone heads that it chopped down every tree, wrecked its own soil, starved itself, and collapsed into war and cannibalism as punishment for its own greed. That story has been printed in textbooks, repeated in documentaries, and used in speeches about climate change and self-destruction for half a century. And in the last 2 years, using drone photography, isotope chemistry, and the most detailed digital model of the island ever built, scientists have shown that almost none of it happened the way we were told. The people did not destroy themselves. They were hit by something else entirely, they adapted to it, they survived it, and then something else came from outside and finished what the myth blamed them for doing to themselves. Let's start with where this island actually is, because the location alone tells you how impossible everything on it was to build. Easter Island, called Rapa Nui by the people who live there, sits in the South Pacific roughly 2,300 miles from the nearest continent. It is one of the most isolated inhabited places on the surface of the planet. There is no nearby land to trade with, no neighboring island to call for help, nothing but open ocean in every direction for weeks of sailing. The ancestors of the Rapa Nui people reached this speck of volcanic rock sometime between the 7th and 13th centuries, crossing thousands of miles of open Pacific with no compass, no metal instruments, and no written charts. They read the stars, the shape of ocean swells, the behavior of birds, and the direction of prevailing winds, and they passed that knowledge down by word of mouth across generations because it was never written anywhere. When they finally reached this island, they found a piece of volcanic land with no other people on it, in a landscape that was, by any practical standard, difficult to live on. Once they settled, they began carving. Not small figures, enormous stone statues, cut directly out of the wall of a volcanic crater called Rano Raraku, using nothing but harder stone tools, no metal of any kind, no wheels, and no draft animals to help move the finished work. The average completed statue stands around 13 feet tall and weighs roughly 14 tons. The tallest one ever successfully raised onto a platform stood over 30 feet high. And still sitting in the quarry today, never finished, is a statue that would have stood close to 70 feet tall and weighed more than 200 tons if it had ever been completed. Across the island, researchers have documented close to 1,000 of these figures. Some stand upright on massive ceremonial stone platforms called ahu. Some lie fallen on their faces. Many were abandoned partway through carving, permanently attached to the rock they were cut from, frozen at the exact moment the work stopped. Think about what that arrival actually required. The ancestors of the Rapa Nui were part of one of the greatest waves of human exploration in our species' history, the Polynesian expansion, in which small groups of voyagers in double-hulled canoes systematically found and settled almost every habitable island scattered across the vast Pacific Ocean, from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the south to Rapa Nui in the east, over the course of roughly 1,000 years. They did this before Europe had reliable oceanic navigation of any kind. They did it by building an intimate, generational knowledge of how the ocean behaves, the direction swells travel when they bounce off unseen land hundreds of miles away, which stars rise and set at which point on the horizon during which season, which bird species range how far from shore before returning to roost. None of that knowledge lived on paper. It lived in trained memory, tested against real voyages, corrected by real mistakes, and handed from one generation of navigators to the next. Reaching Rapa Nui at all, a single speck of volcanic rock in an empty stretch of ocean larger than most continents, was already one of the most demanding feats of navigation in pre-modern human history. For most of the 20th century, the explanation for all of this was simple. Religious monuments, ancestor worship, rival clans competing to build bigger statues than their neighbors as a display of status and power, using up the island's resources in an escalating contest until there was nothing left. That explanation eventually hardened into the most famous version of the story, the one you've probably heard, that the islanders felled every tree on Rapa Nui to move their statues, wrecked the ecosystem that supported them, and triggered a population collapse, warfare, and even cannibalism as a direct result of their own obsession. It is a tidy story. It has a clear moral. And 2 major pieces of research published in the last year and a half have taken that story apart, not by disputing that something dramatic happened on this island, but by showing that the actual cause was almost entirely different from what generations of readers were told. The first piece of that new picture comes from a study led by scientists at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, published in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment. The team wanted a cleaner way to reconstruct the island's ancient climate than anyone had used before, so they pulled sediment cores out of 2 of the very few freshwater sources on Rapa Nui, a high-elevation wetland called Rano Aroi and a volcanic crater lake called Rano Kau. Buried inside those layers of sediment are the preserved waxy coatings of ancient plant leaves, and locked inside those waxes is a chemical signature, the ratio of heavy to light hydrogen, that tracks almost directly with how much rain fell on the island when those leaves were alive. By measuring that ratio at intervals through the sediment, the researchers built a continuous rainfall record stretching back roughly 800 years, the longest and most detailed climate reconstruction Rapa Nui has ever had. What they found was a drought unlike anything else in that 8th century record. Starting around the year 1550, annual rainfall on the island dropped by somewhere between 600 and 800 millimeters compared with the previous 3 centuries, and it stayed that low for more than 100 years. On an island that already had almost no rivers, no permanent streams, and only a handful of natural freshwater sources to begin with, a drop of that size is not a bad season. It is a fundamental generational crisis. And when the researchers lined up the timing of that drought against the archaeological record, they found something that the ecocide story never accounted for. Construction of the big ceremonial ahu platforms slowed sharply during exactly this period. Political and religious authority started shifting away from the old system tied to chiefly lineages, and a new tradition took over, one called the Tangata Manu, or Birdman competition, in which leadership was earned through an annual athletic contest rather than inherited through bloodline. The island's whole social structure reorganized itself around the crisis. Here is the detail that matters most. The lead researchers on that study have been explicit that their findings do not support a story of population collapse or societal breakdown driven by resource exhaustion. What the data shows instead is resilience. Faced with a drought that lasted longer than a human lifetime, on an island with almost nowhere to run, the Rapa Nui people changed how they organized themselves, changed which rituals mattered, changed who held power, and kept going. They did not vanish. They adapted to one of the harshest climate shocks their environment could produce on a piece of land smaller than most cities, with no ability to import food or water from anywhere else on Earth. That is not a story about a civilization destroying itself through excess. That is a story about a civilization absorbing a natural disaster that would break most modern supply chains, and surviving it anyway. It's worth sitting with how big a 600 to 800 millimeter drop in yearly rainfall actually is. That is not a bad summer. That is a change on the scale of turning a normally green landscape into something close to a semi-arid one, sustained for over 100 years, roughly 4 to 5 human generations. On a continent, a shift like that pushes populations to migrate to better land somewhere else. On an island, barely 60 square miles in size, in the middle of the emptiest ocean on the planet, there was nowhere else to go. Every response to that crisis had to happen inside the same 60 square miles the drought was strangling. That is the context that makes the shift to the Tangata Manu system so remarkable. Instead of collapsing into open warfare over the shrinking freshwater supply, the islanders built a new competitive ritual, an annual contest in which representatives from different clans swam through open, shark-populated water to a nearby islet to retrieve the first seabird egg of the season, with the winning clan's chosen leader gaining ceremonial authority for the following year. It replaced a rigid, hereditary system with something closer to an annual, negotiated contest for status, a social innovation that let competing groups keep resolving their rivalry without breaking the island apart. The second major piece of new evidence came only a few weeks later from a completely different team, using a completely different method, and it attacks a different part of the old myth, the idea that the statues were the product of a single powerful ruling class commanding forced labor across the whole island. Researchers led by Carl Lipo at Binghamton University flew drones in careful low sweeps over Rano Raraku, the main quarry, and collected more than 11,000 overlapping photographs. Using a photography technique called structure from motion photogrammetry, they stitched those thousands of images into the first true high-resolution three-dimensional model ever made of the quarry, a site so steep and dangerous in places that researchers on foot had never been able to map most of it properly. The model let them see angles, ledges, and carving surfaces that no ground survey in over a century of study had ever documented. What the model revealed was not one big centralized work site. It showed 426 statues frozen at different stages of completion, 341 separate extraction trenches cut into the rock, 133 empty voids where finished statues had already been removed, and, most importantly, 30 clearly separate zones of carving activity, each with its own distinct style, its own techniques, and its own boundaries. That pattern does not look like one authority directing labor from the top down across the whole island. It looks like something closer to 30 independent workshops, run by separate extended family or clan groups, each working in their own territory, each developing slightly different carving habits, all contributing to the same island-wide tradition without a single command structure forcing them to. The researchers who led the study have said plainly that this challenges one of the oldest assumptions in Rapa Nui archaeology, the idea that only a powerful, centralized chiefdom could have organized labor on this scale. The truth the model points to is closer to the opposite, a distributed society made up of many self-organizing groups, choosing to take part in a shared cultural project generation after generation. There's a practical reason this project needed 3D scanning to reveal it in the first place. Rano Raraku is a genuinely dangerous place to survey on foot. It's a steep-sided volcanic crater, and statues emerge from the cliff face at every conceivable angle, some carved horizontally into the rock, some vertically, some stacked in production sequences that overlap each other across different points in time. A two-dimensional map, the kind researchers had relied on for over a century of study, simply cannot capture that. You can't see the tops of statues, the undersides of ledges, or the full extraction sequence of a trench from ground level, and you certainly can't do it safely while trying to preserve a fragile archaeological site. The drone-based model changed that completely, letting researchers examine the quarry from angles no field archaeologist had ever been able to reach, and the timing turned out to matter for another reason too. A wildfire tore through part of the quarry in October 2023, and the urgency of documenting the site before further damage occurred was part of what pushed the survey forward as fast as it did. That detail also connects to one of the most debated questions about the whole island. How did people without wheels or draft animals actually move statues weighing over a dozen tons from the quarry to platforms scattered across the coastline? For decades, the working theory was that they laid the statues flat and dragged them on wooden sledges using massive amounts of rope and manpower. But experimental archaeology, conducted by researchers studying the statue's base shape, has shown something stranger and, honestly, more impressive. The statues were carved with a forward-leaning center of gravity and a rounded base. Teams of people using ropes attached to either side of the statue, plus one team at the back, could rock the statue side to side in a controlled rhythm, essentially walking it forward on its own base, upright, the same way you might walk a heavy refrigerator into position by rocking it corner to corner. Full-scale replica tests with real teams of people have actually moved multi-ton concrete replicas this way, covering real distance in a matter of minutes. It matches local oral tradition, which has always said the statues walk to their places. It does not require a wheel. It does not require draft animals. It requires an extremely precise understanding of weight, balance, and coordinated group rhythm, which is, on its own, a remarkable technical achievement for a Stone Age society working with nothing but rope, timber, and carved stone. That same experimental work has helped explain something else that used to puzzle researchers: why so many fallen statues along the island's old transport roads lie face down with damage concentrated specifically at the base, rather than being scattered or broken across their whole length, the way a dragged object typically would be. A statue moved upright by controlled rocking is only ever balanced on its base. Lose the rhythm, misjudge the angle, or hit a patch of uneven ground, and the statue topples forward onto its face, with the stress concentrated exactly where the base meets the ground. That pattern matches what's actually found in the field far better than the old dragged-on-a-sledge theory ever did, and it's part of why the walking hypothesis has gained real traction among researchers over the last 2 decades, even though the topic is still debated, and not every specialist agrees on every detail of how it was done. Now to the part of the island's story that remains genuinely, completely unsolved. Rapa Nui has its own writing system called rongorongo, made up of intricate carved symbols pressed into wooden tablets. It is one of only a small handful of times in the entire history of the human species that writing appears to have been invented completely independently, without contact with any other literate culture. And to this day, in 2026, nobody can read it. Roughly 24 genuine tablets survive, scattered across museum collections in Chile, Europe, and the United States, holding somewhere around 15,000 legible glyphs in total. That is an extremely small sample to work with, and the modern spoken Rapa Nui language has drifted so far from whatever language the tablets were originally written, in that it offers only limited help in cracking the code. In more than 100 years of attempts, only one small fragment, a portion of a single tablet, has been convincingly connected to anything specific, a sequence that appears to track a lunar calendar. Even that partial reading cannot actually be translated word for word. Everything else on every other tablet remains, formally, a mystery. That has not stopped people from trying. And in 2025, a researcher named Eric Kiley published a claim that he had fully deciphered all of the known rongorongo inscriptions, arguing the script functions as a syllabary encoding Polynesian mythology, genealogies, ritual knowledge, and navigational information. It is a bold claim, and it has not been peer-reviewed or accepted by the broader academic community studying the script. That matters, because the actual history of rongorongo research is littered with confident decipherment claims that eventually fell apart under scrutiny. Scholars working in this field count at least 20 previous attempts at full decipherment that failed to hold up once other researchers tried to verify them. So the honest current status of rongorongo, as of right now, is this: It is real writing, it is completely unread, and any claim that someone has cracked the whole thing needs to be treated as a hypothesis, waiting for independent confirmation, not as settled fact. The tablets are still, quite literally, silent. Part of what makes Rongorongo so hard to crack is how the object itself works against decipherment. Researchers have pointed out that the script is written in what's called reverse boustrophodon, meaning the reader has to flip the tablet upside down at the end of every single line to continue reading the next one in the correct orientation, an arrangement with almost no parallel anywhere else in the history of writing. Radiocarbon testing published in 2025 on a batch of surviving wooden tablets confirmed that at least some of the objects predate significant outside contact with the island, supporting the idea that the script really was developed independently by the Rapa Nui themselves, rather than inspired by contact with literate outsiders, which would make it one of only a handful of times in all of recorded human history that a society invented writing completely on its own, alongside places like ancient Sumer, ancient China, and Mesoamerica. That independence is exactly what makes the unsolved nature of the script so remarkable. This isn't a lost dialect of a language we already understand elsewhere. It's a wholly separate invention, tied to a culture and a language that changed dramatically after European contact. And the tablets that survive represent a tiny, scattered fragment of whatever the full written record once was. So, if it wasn't ecological suicide, and if it wasn't a top-down empire building monuments to feed one ruler's ego, what actually did bring the old Rapa Nui world to an end? The honest answer, based on the current evidence, is contact with the outside world, and it came late, and it came violently. European ships did not reach the island until 1722, when a Dutch expedition led by Jacob Brogeveen landed on Easter Sunday and gave the island the name most of the world still uses for it. Written accounts from those early European visits already describe an island that had gone through real change, smaller populations in some areas, a different social structure than outsiders expected. Evidence consistent with a society that had already spent generations adapting to that long drought. What came after European contact was worse than anything that came before it. Introduced diseases the islanders had no immunity to sweep through the population. And in the 1860s, slave raiders from Peru arrived and forcibly abducted a huge portion of the remaining population, taking them to work and die in mainland mining and agricultural operations. Combined with smallpox brought back by the handful of survivors who were eventually returned, the population of Rapa Nui collapsed to a tiny fraction of what it had been. That is where the real devastation happened. Not centuries earlier from felling trees, generations later from ships, chains, and disease arriving from outside a world the islanders had never had contact with before. Step back and look at the full shape of what the newest research is actually telling us, because it is a genuinely different island than the one most of us grew up hearing about. This was not a society that destroyed its own home through greed and superstition. It was a community that crossed one of the most dangerous stretches of open ocean on the planet, using nothing but memory and observation, settled one of the most isolated pieces of land on Earth, and built a shared cultural tradition of monumental stone carving that persisted for centuries across dozens of independent family groups without a single ruler forcing them to. When a drought hit that dropped rainfall by hundreds of millimeters a year for over 100 years, on an island where fresh water was already scarce, they did not collapse. They restructured their entire society around survival, shifted their spiritual and political systems, and kept their culture intact. They developed one of the only truly independent writing systems in human history, one so specialized and so tightly tied to their own language and worldview that 200 years after outsiders first saw it, nobody outside their own culture has ever been able to read it. And when destruction did finally come to Rapa Nui, it did not come from inside. It came from outside in the form of disease and slavery, delivered by people who had nothing to do with building any of it. The unfinished statue, still sitting in the quarry wall at Rano Raraku, is often described as evidence of a civilization that ran out of resources mid-project, a frozen monument to collapse. The newer evidence points somewhere else. Researchers studying the quarry now describe it as an active, ongoing production site right up until European contact disrupted it, not a site abandoned in crisis. It was not left behind because the people building it ran out of trees or ran out of food or ran out of will. It was left behind because everything about the world they were operating in changed, suddenly from outside, in a way 300 years of stone carving tradition could never have prepared them for. That is the actual story the data supports. Not a morality tale about a society punishing itself for its own excess. A story about extraordinary human resilience on one of the loneliest pieces of land on Earth, disrupted in the end by forces that had nothing to do with the statues at all. The stone heads people around the world recognize on sight were never a monument to failure. They were the visible surface of a society that adapted to a climate disaster, most modern places would struggle to survive, organized its labor without central command, and built one of the rarest writing systems in human history along the way. There's also a quieter lesson buried in why this correction took so long to arrive. It isn't that the physical evidence changed. The sediment under those crater lakes had been sitting there for 800 years. The quarry had been standing in the same shape for centuries. What changed was the resolution of the tools. Researchers finally pointed at that evidence. Hydrogen isotopes in ancient leaf wax had never been measured on this island with this level of precision before. A steep, dangerous volcanic crater had never been captured in full, three-dimensional detail before, because doing it safely on foot simply wasn't possible. The old story about ecological suicide wasn't built by liars. It was built by researchers, working with the tools and techniques available decades ago, doing their honest best with a much blurrier picture. It just happened to line up conveniently with a modern anxiety about environmental self-destruction, which is part of why it spread so widely and stuck around so long after specialists in the field had already started raising doubts about it. We spent 50 years telling this island's story wrong. The last 2 years of research are the first real chance to finally tell it right. Not because the mystery is gone either, because it isn't. Nobody can fully explain how a Stone Age society without metal tools carved and moved objects weighing over a dozen tons with this level of precision. Nobody can read a single full sentence of Rongorongo, and may never be able to. What we can say now, with real evidence behind it, is what this island's story is not. It is not a cautionary tale about a people who destroyed their own home through greed. It is the story of a small, resourceful society that crossed one of the most dangerous oceans on Earth to find this place, adapted to a climate disaster that would break most modern nations, organized itself without a central ruler forcing anyone's hand, and kept building, kept adapting, kept surviving, right up until the outside world arrived and did what the drought never could.